Hello, my name is Will Landers. I'm a director here at the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our eighth podcast, BrazilCham Talks. It's great to have Brian Winter with us here today. He's the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly. He's been covering Latin American politics for over a quarter century. He's written several books with very important people like Fernando Henrique Cardoso, President Uribe from Colombia, and others. And he's a good friend of ours. So, Brian, thank you for being here with us.
Will, I'm happy to be here. And during World Cup season, maybe we should mention my other book, which was with Pelé, which we wrote for the 2014 Cup in Brazil and which I'm still very proud of.
Amazing, amazing. Thanks for that reminder. Uh, Brian, so much to talk about. We just had Brazil Week here in New York not too long ago. And to me, it was interesting because listening to the Brazilians in town, it felt like they were talking about a different Brazil than the one I was watching and reading about in the newspapers or in the press. It feels like it's a country that's stable and unstable at the same time. So, can you please describe to us how do you see Brazil today?
Well, this is a recurring theme, Will. I mean, people outside Brazil are more bullish on Brazil right now, in general terms. And I think there's some reasons for that. One of them has to do with the global context right now. We're in an era where there's a war in Iran, there's a war in Ukraine, and there's always the threat of violence erupting in places like Taiwan. And, Sao Paulo and Brazil writ large have the benefit of being many thousands of miles away from those conflict zones. And in an era where, we see ever more war and ever more conflict, Brazil and kind of South America as a whole looks like a place that has the luxury of not only geographic distance, but geopolitical distance. Has the food and the renewable energy and the critical minerals among other things that the rest of the world needs. And, it's funny, I speak to investor audiences a lot. And when I repeat that message in front of Brazilian audiences, people kind of look at me skeptically.
Hmm.
And when I speak to audiences that have portfolios in other parts of the planet, they're all kind of vigorously nodding their heads. Because, if you think distance does not matter, go talk to people who live and work in Dubai or
Hmm.
Tokyo or Berlin or even New York, you know. Um, so, none of that is to downplay the challenges that Brazil has right now. I certainly understand why Brazilians are feeling, ambiguous or even negative about the current trajectory of the country. I get it. I think there are reasons for that. But again, like if you look at kind of the world as a whole, I still think Brazil and Latin America as a whole look pretty good.
And thinking about Brazil's place in the world, right? Brazil is obviously one of the loud voices in the BRICS, talking about a new currency, always trying to align itself with a lot of the countries that form BRICS, and especially with China being the biggest trading partner with Brazil. But then a few weeks ago, we had President Lula being received, apparently very well received by President Trump in the White House. So where does Brazil fit in today's geopolitical situation?
I think Brazil, like a lot of so-called middle powers and like a lot of other countries in Latin America, is trying to strike a balance. They are, as is well known, China has been Brazil's number one trading partner by a healthy margin for many years now. And what's striking to me is somebody who, spends quite a bit of time in Brazil, but also in other Latin American capitals, is virtually everyone is trying to strike this balance right now in the region. You ask people, regardless of whether they're on the ideological left, right, or center, what keeps them awake at night. And they say that their nightmare is having to choose between Washington or Beijing. They
Hmm.
have reasons to, want to keep their main trading partner happy while also wanting to keep happy, a country like the United States with so many cultural, social, and still investment ties as well. The United States remains the biggest investor in Latin America as a whole, dwarfing the Chinese, even though the trading relationship has obviously shifted. So, that's what I see for Brazil. And in that sense, if you look at the travel that President Lula has done over the last couple of years, it's actually really striking. I mean, he has not only taken virtually the same photo of himself smiling with both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, he has also led trade delegations to Vietnam, to Japan. He had this kind of bromance with Emmanuel Macron, the French premier. He met with MBS, the Saudi crown prince. And this, this is representative, I think, of what Brazil is trying to do as a whole and other countries in the region too.
So yeah, so talk about President Lula. We're finishing his third term. We'll talk about the elections in a minute. But other than his world travels, all the miles he collected on Brazil One or whatever we call that plane, what surprised you about his third term? What have been some of the big victories, and if anything, what's been disappointing to you during the last 3 years?
Well, I think it's fair to say that while he has been successful kind of on the trade and investment front, he has been less successful on he tried to position himself as a kind of master negotiator at the beginning of his term, at the beginning of this third term. He gave the impression that at least that he was trying to win a Nobel Peace Prize by wading into the foray in places like Ukraine and then in Gaza. Both those initiatives failed in pretty spectacular fashion. And what you have seen over the last year or two is maybe a more downsized Lula who is doing what, seems to be in the best interest of the country, which is trying to build trade and investment ties with everybody and trying to
Mhm.
keep the relationship positive with President Trump, even when that has been very difficult. I think on the foreign policy side, there's that. On the domestic policy side, look, for the first 2 years of President Lula's third term, the Brazilian economy outperformed expectations. There's a dynamism to the Brazilian economy that is not only explained by commodities exports, but also by things like PIX, which has brought a new dynamism to the financial sector. Perhaps also the effect of pension and tax reforms that were done in both this government in the case of tax and previous ones in the case of pension and labor probably brought a new dynamism to the Brazilian economy. But the big question mark, as everyone watching this conversation I'm sure knows, is fiscal. And, the question is how much of that overperformance the surpassing of expectations that we saw from Brazilian GDP during this Lula 3.0, how much of that was unsustainable because it was generated by fiscal spending. And look, governments all over the world are overspending right now. The United States is certainly no exception. But the United States, of course, has the world's global reserve currency, and Brazil does not. And a nominal deficit upwards of 9% of GDP which is what most expect for 2026, just is not sustainable. So that's going to be a big question mark, not only for Lula's legacy, but also for whoever gets elected in October, whether that's Lula or somebody else. This is something that I think there's universal agreement, including from within inside the government, that they're going to have to address.
And addressing that, I think it leads us to a discussion on the governability of Brazil, right? I think you made some parallels with the United States, and I think in the U.S. we've seen the presidency gain power from the legislative during the Trump 2.0, or as you call it, the Lula 3.0. It seems like in Brazil it's been a different direction with the legislative powers gaining power over the executive. And but you have this big issue of having to somehow get the fiscal house in order. So how do we do that?
Well, you've touched on a big challenge, which is that it's not just Lula's fault. You now have an unprecedented percentage of Brazil's budget spending under the control of Congress. And this is such an amazing transition, Will, from the Brazil that I first got to know 20 years ago,
Mhm.
where, it was a very powerful executive. But so much of that power was given away during the 2010s. It was delegated to Congress as sort of the price of unpopular presidents staying in power, at least for a little while. And so now today you have leaders of Congress with so much power. I've heard of delegations of foreign investors who now go to Brasilia and don't even bother to request a meeting at the presidential palace.
Hmm.
They go straight instead to see the presidents of each house of Congress and some other power players there. And some of them have gone to see Supreme Court ministers as well, believing that they're actually more powerful than the president. I don't want to downplay the role that the executive has had in this. I mean, clearly that's a big part of the story, but as with so many things with Brazil, é complicado. It's complicated. Where,
Right.
I'm old enough to remember when Republicans were the party of fiscal responsibility. That's no longer the case.
No, it's been a
Um,
while.
it's been a while. And, and I say we here in the American sense, continue to just spend and spend. Uh, I remember 15 years ago when a group of legislators in the Republican Party got elected over, fiscal deficits under President Obama that were a fraction of what are being run now. Anyway, I don't want to go too deep on the dysfunction in my own country, Will. But I would just note that this magic realism when it comes to thinking about the fiscal side is something that seems to be in the air virtually everywhere. Unfortunately for Brazil, there's agreement that it's going to come to a head first because Brazil is a country where historically the troublemaker is fiscal policy. That's what we saw during the 2010s, and there's expectation that, despite everything that's been going right in the Brazilian economy, which we talked about at the start of the conversation, so much demand for not only Brazilian soy, beef, iron ore, but also Brazilian oil. I was looking at the numbers the other day, not only the biggest Latin America producer of oil these days, but it's actually double Mexico and four times Guyana. I mean, it's
Mhm.
amazing what's happened in that sector. But as always in Brazil, this good story will be overtaken if the government cannot get the fiscal house in order.
Yeah, that seems to be a main issue that nobody wants to tackle, but it's coming to a hand here. And so I think it leads us a little bit into a discussion about the election, right? Um, the polls seem to be going all over the place. I think luckily we'll have at least a few weeks of quiet on that front now as the World Cup starts. We're taping this 2 days before the Brazil-Morocco game. But if the election was held today, what do you think would be the results of the election?
I suspect, Will, and I say this as someone who has lost quite a bit of faith in polling, not just in Brazil, but elsewhere throughout the Americas in recent years. If the election was held on Sunday, it seems that Lula would win. But the election is not being held on Sunday. And
Hmm.
we're having this conversation at, what may go down as Flavio Bolsonaro's weakest moment of the campaign because he is still reeling from the effects of this scandal at Banco Master. But before we get into the horse race, I think it's useful to talk about the kind of the broader dynamic, which you have already referenced, which is one of a certain pessimism about the Brazilian economy and about the direction the country is headed. And there was some polling not long ago that backed this up, that said 65% of Brazilians believe that the country is heading in the wrong direction, and a similar number when asked if the economy was in bad shape, 65% said yes, that it is that it is in bad shape. Those are numbers from Ipsos. And, if you were looking from the outside in, you might find these numbers mystifying because on the other hand, you have GDP that is growing, at about 2% this year. You have unemployment at an all-time low of around 5%. You have inflation, broadly speaking, under control. It's ticked up a little bit lately, but still, between 4.5% and 5%. The stock market has recently been at record highs. It's come down a bit. So, you would see these numbers and think that, gosh, why are people so pessimistic? And I think interestingly, there have been so many parallels that we've already discussed during this conversation, Will, between the United States and Brazil. But I think there's some similar dynamics. And I don't actually, my Portuguese is okay, but I'm not sure if there's a Portuguese word for affordability, which has
Mhm.
become this buzzword here in the United States that essentially, talks about how costs have gone up and wages have not kept pace. And we see a similar dynamic in Brazil that has been complicated by, again, this fiscal policy and monetary policy. I mean, you have central bank that has pushed interest rates in Brazil to 14.5%. Uh, and we already said that inflation is about 4.5, so that gives you real rates of about 10%, which is either the highest in the world or very close. And the effect that this has had not just on government debt, but on families, who of course borrow at vastly higher rates usually than the 14.5% rate. And it's so bad that, and our Brazilian listeners, I'm sure, know this, but the Lula government has launched a program during this election year, this Novo Desenrola Brasil, which is designed with the purpose of getting families out of debt, offering them favorable interest rates and the ability to pay in up to 48 installments some of this debt that they've accumulated. This is benefits that are primarily open to poor segments of the population. And so, you do have this situation where you have a lot of Brazilians who are employed, they have jobs, but they just feel like they're not getting ahead. They're part of this, often part of the services economy, where productivity is very low and where people are really struggling. So, I think that's the economic dynamic in this election, Will. You also have some personal dynamics where, of course, President Lula, there's been a lot of commentary around his age. And to be clear, I'm not an anti-ageist. He'll be 80. He's 80 now. He'll be 81 when the second round vote happens. And I want to say here that and this is true, some of the most modern, agile minds I know are people in their 70s and 80s. But look, the fact is that President Lula has been the central figure of Brazilian politics since he ran for president for the first time in 1989. That was 37 years ago, Will. And I'm sure that there are people listening to this conversation that weren't even born then. And gosh, that is an awful lot of time for somebody to be kind of sitting at the center of Brazilian politics. And I think it's one of the reasons why, when you spend time in Brazil, as I do, and you talk to people even who voted for Lula somewhat enthusiastically in 2022, it's really hard to find anybody who is excited about voting for him again this year. I mean, to be clear, there's a lot of people who are going to vote for him. But the level of excitement is very low. And I think it's because, not only some fatigue, but just the feeling that he personally is a bit out of touch with a country that is more socially conservative, more religious, more entrepreneurial than it was 20 years ago.
But then those that aren't too excited about voting for him, they're looking for an option, right? And then we have Flavio Bolsonaro as the other main candidate. Are the Bolsonaros still the only viable option that we have today to run against Lula, or is right of center or the center? Are there other options that could be a threat to President Lula in the election?
We'll see. I think that as we have this conversation, Will, I these last day or two, even because of some polling, I've been increasingly asking this question of whether someone else might essentially steal Flavio Bolsonaro's lunch, right? Whether somebody might be able to step into that role and become a new standard bearer for the Brazilian right. The polls show a couple of things. The polling suggests that Brazilians would be theoretically open to another right-wing candidate. Some analysts say that as much as 30 or even 40% of the population would consider a name that was neither Lula nor Bolsonaro. But look, voters don't vote for imaginary
Right.
figures. It has to be a name. And as you look around, I mean, there are two governors, Zema, the governor of Minas, and the Caiado, the governor of Goiás, who have, tried to position themselves in that lane, but have kind of failed to pick up anything more than 3 or 4% support in polling. There's a figure who, this Renan Santos,
Hmm.
he's quite young. He's 42 years old. He's a right-wing figure who has led a, dynamic campaign on,
Someone call him the Malay of Brazil.
well, I would call him in some ways perhaps the Bolsonaro of 2026, maybe.
Okay.
Because,
Okay.
and the reason I say that is because he's using kind of the same model that Jair Bolsonaro did back in 2018. I remember, when Jair Bolsonaro first started to surge on social media, and I said, gosh, this seems like a guy who could win. And I had lots of Brazilians very patiently explain to me that those types of candidates never win in
Mhm.
Brazil and that I didn't really understand the country because, among other things, you had to have TV time. You had to have time for television ads, free ads based on the strength of your political party in Congress. So now here in 2026, the Bolsonaro family has TV time and Renan Santos does not. Wouldn't it be ironic if the Bolsonaro family was overtaken by a social media savvy candidate on the right?
Mm.
Um, but look, I mean, that's a possibility that's getting some buzz right now. I don't know, so much of the Bolsonaro support has come from the evangelical Christian community, which previously did not really have someone in the political space who they felt like represented them. That, of course, is now between 27 and 30% of the Brazilian population. It's a segment that has grown incredibly fast over the last 30, 40 years. I watch Renan Santos and I openly question whether he or these other figures would be able to, connect with that population in the same way that the Bolsonaro family has. But obviously, the X factor, or one of the X factors, is whether we'll see further revelations in this Banco Master scandal, and what kind of effect that could have on the Bolsonaro family. We'll see.
But of course, in a sense, so anybody that wins would still have to deal with the issue with Congress and how to deal with it and how to work with them to get anything done, right?
Yeah,
And,
but look, I mean, there have been presidents who have taken office in more complicated moments than the next president will,
yeah,
including in
absolutely.
recent history. And going back to our original comments, I think there's so much going in Brazil's favor. And I actually, I've been making an argument as someone who talks about Latin America as a whole that has angered some of my Brazilian friends. As we record this, Will, we still don't know the result of the election in Peru. The Colombia election is in the second round is in a couple weeks, and of course, the Brazilian election is in October. I actually believe that of those three elections, Brazil is the least important.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is, of course, the Brazilian election is important, but Colombia, for example, um, two radically different candidates in a country that is facing not only a grave fiscal situation, but a very scary security crisis, a lot of strain on its institutions. And because of the composition of the political map and kind of where they are in their history, whoever wins this runoff in Colombia will determine the fate of Colombia for the next 10 to 15 years, with all kinds of implications for the economy, for security, for geopolitics, and so on. Similarly, in Peru, I think you have just radically different candidates. And, when it comes to Brazil, look, Lula, certainly from a market perspective, from an investor perspective, has his faults. But during Lula's most radical period, which was the 1990s, he was asked in an interview who was his economic idol or who was his model. And he gave a really interesting answer. His answer was Henry Ford. He said, what I want is to create a Brazil where the workers are paid enough to be able to buy the product their factory produces. Um, and look, that is the answer of someone who is fundamentally a capitalist. And Lula, whatever his other flaws, I believe that Lula is fundamentally a capitalist. Maybe not everybody in his party is, but he is. And I cannot imagine Roberto Sanchez, the candidate on the left in Peru, or Ivan Cepeda in Colombia. I cannot imagine them saying Henry Ford. So, in a way, my point is, I think the range of outcomes in Brazil, while important, is not as wide as it is in some of these other countries. And that's ultimately a good thing for Brazil.
Yeah. And you mentioned institutions. I mean, obviously, Brazil institutions were tested in 2022 with the January 8th events and a lot of talk about the power of the judicial system in Brazil today. In the whole discussion, executive legislative, seems like the judicial system also, you mentioned yourself, a lot of investors looking to talk to judges before even talking to ministers. Um, where are we today with the democratic institutions in Brazil? Are they stronger, weaker? Is it concerning to you? Where are we?
That's a difficult question, Will. In some ways, I think we're seeing the same so-called guerra de poderes, the same war among the powers that has characterized Brazil probably since, the lead up to the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, this battle for supremacy between the legislative, the judiciary, and the executive. We see a version of this here in the United States and in many other countries as well. I mean, it's humbling to speak on this subject as an American in 2026 because of our own institutions having been placed under strain. You may have heard we even had our own January 8th.
I've heard of it. It
Yeah,
was actually my birthday. Now people don't even celebrate my birthday anymore on January
it
6th.
was January 6th, is that right?
Yes.
Um, you know, so look, as far as where we stand in Brazil, I do think it does seem that a reckoning of sorts is coming for at least some members of the Supreme Court. Um, there are there have been aspects of the power enjoyed by individual Supreme Court justices over the last 4+ years that are virtually impossible to explain to a foreign audience, to a non-Brazilian audience. I mean, when I speak to American audiences about some of the decisions that have been made by individual judges, people just their mouths gape.
Hmm.
And, I know that the Brazilian system is different in some ways than the American system, but I also know enough about Brazilian jurisprudence to know that not only have those some of those actions been questionable, but in political terms, you now have the very novel development of candidates campaigning for Congress in Brazil, where the number one item on their platform is impeachment of specific Supreme Court justices. And I think this speaks to a public that has felt very strongly that some of that power has been abused. Um, but it's not just them. I had the experience, Will, you mentioned January 8th. I had the experience of being inside the Palacio do Planalto about 2 weeks after that attack took place. And I saw the glass that was still shattered. And I saw the Di Cavalcanti painting there in the atrium that had been stabbed by someone with a knife
Hmm.
in a dozen different spots. And you really felt a sensation that I had felt 2 years previous in 2020 as an American of, democracy really hanging in the balance. My sense is that since then, things have stabilized, but there are still these huge questions, and a lot of our countries are trying to sort them out.
Yeah. Interesting times for sure, all over the place, not just Brazil, right? So maybe talking a little bit about the U.S. Brazil relations. We haven't touched on tariffs yet, but tariffs have been a major issue since President Trump came back to power here in the U.S. Uh, Very confusing to know where we are on a day-to-day basis, who's impacted by it, what's coming next. So, can you give us a quick rundown today? Where are we with that, and who's more at risk at this stage?
Maybe it would be helpful to go back in time a little bit and sort of explore how this whole thing
Sure.
started. I'll be brief, but some of even the stories that we tell ourselves have changed as we've learned new details over the
Mhm.
last couple of months. And ostensibly, this really erupted on July 9th, 2025, when President Trump announced the 50% tariff on Brazil, or at least most Brazilian products. There were sanctions against individuals as well, including on the Supreme Court. And that set off a big firestorm that we're still kind of living in the aftermath. But the story that I think in Brazil doesn't get told enough is how and why President Trump seems to have backed down from those 50% tariffs. The narrative that you typically hear is that Lula and Trump ran into each other at the UN General Assembly, and they had this excellent chemistry, and that everything started to get better from there. And my understanding, at least, is that's a very simplistic and in some ways misleading account of what really happened. The story here, once again, was global. Shortly after President Trump imposed the tariffs, there was another different kind of threat that came from China to stop the export of critical minerals and specifically rare earths to the United States as part of their dispute. And my understanding is that then there was a conversation within the US government about, gosh, if we can't get Chinese rare earths over time, where are we going to get them from? And of course, as you know, the second biggest reserves of rare earths in the world at this stage are in Brazil. And that seems to have been a major factor in what led to kind of the unwinding of this more aggressive stance. That meeting between Presidents Trump and Lula at the UN General Assembly had been orchestrated weeks in advance by Richard Grenell, the trusted emissary of President Trump, who traveled to Brazil without it even coming out at the time in the press. Since then, there have been ups and downs. It seemed after the visit that President Lula made to the White House that things had improved. But even that day, I was one of several people who warned, gosh, nothing about this prevents things from, getting sour again really soon. And sure enough, following, 24 hours after Flavio Bolsonaro concluded his visit to the White House in May, we learned that there were new tariffs, although perhaps different in kind of their underlying reasons and where they came from. I think it's going to continue to be ups and downs. I think we have a president in the White House who likes to improvise, to put it diplomatically, and who is also kind of being hit on all sides by different groups within his government who want different things. I think you have groups in places like the Treasury Department, perhaps elsewhere, who are pushing for a more pragmatic relationship with Brazil because of these concerns over things like rare earths and also, the impact that Brazilian beef and coffee and airplane goods could have on inflation here in the United States. And then you have another group that's more ideological that includes a small group of people or at the State Department who see themselves as, more focused on topics like organized crime and really keen to help engineer or at least further this right-wing wave that we've seen sweep so much of Latin America over the last year and a half. And they really want to see a fellow right-wing conservative in charge of Latin America's biggest country. And they're going to do whatever is within their power to try to sort of nudge Brazilian voters toward that outcome. In the middle of all that, you have the president. So I think it's going to continue to be unpredictable. I think we'll continue to see, sort of these episodes of these surprises between now and October when Brazilians finally vote.
Brian, were you as surprised as I was with Brazil's reaction to the whole tariff discussion, which was more to negotiate rather than try to have that knee-jerk reaction that many other countries had, which was to put tariffs on the back on the United States?
Somebody in the Brazilian power apparatus is very good at taking a deep breath.
Which is
And
unusual in many of these instances, right? To have somebody like that and to
well,
have the power to be able to control it.
I suspect, in fact, I strongly believe that the Brazilians have had conversations with others who have been in these negotiations with President Trump, including the Mexican government. The
Mm.
Mexican government, is another one that has really been, I think, even more, much more so than Brazil, has been under pressure from President Trump. And, you know, they are more exposed to the US than Brazil is. I mean, Mexico, I believe, sends more than 85% of its exports to the US, shares a 2,000-mile long border. I think the number in Brazil is closer to 10% of exports go to the United States. Obviously, it's quite different. But this tactic of I'm sure in many occasions, cursing under your breath, but then, putting on a brave face and acting cool in public and not responding right away with either words or actions, I think has benefited countries, including Brazil, that have done this. I also will have my eyes wide open. Um, it's also clear that Brazil and Mexico and other countries, at the same time that they are moving to, at least try to accommodate what President Trump wants, they are also concluding that the United States is not as stable or reliable an ally as it was in years past, and therefore moving to diversify their trading relationships. I mean, the person who was most responsible for the approval of the EU-Mercosur trade deal after 25 years of negotiations was Donald Trump.
Hmm.
And the Mexicans have just signed a new trade agreement with the Europeans as well. You see leaders from Latin America and from Europe going to India, Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia in the same way that President Lula has. So, I think governments have learned this kind of two-step approach where they do their level best to sometimes to swallow their pride and try to talk to the man in the White House, but at the same time, they're reaching conclusions about the reliability of the United States and trying to diversify accordingly.
Um, you speak to a lot of people in a lot of different countries, not just in Brazil. I mean, you travel all over Latin America. Um, how do other countries in Latin America view Brazil? Is Brazil seen as, because of its size, is it seen as one of the leaders? Does it play that role as a regional leader? Or is it more, oh, they're the only Portuguese speakers and they kind of left on its own? And um, is there such a thing as a regional board that really works?
Well, speaking honestly, I think there's a view in other Latin American capitals that Brazil takes its position of leadership for granted and does not consult as much as it should with other governments. And by the way, this was a view that predated this recent right-wing shift that we've seen.
Hmm.
I remember being in Chile during the Boric administration, not long after President Lula was elected in 2022. And someone in that government said to me sarcastically, well, I guess Lula's coming back to boss us all around again. And my jaw dropped because I didn't expect to hear that.
Right.
And, to be clear, President Boric and President Lula eventually established a positive relationship. But I've heard that view in other capitals as well. I think, especially during the first year or two of President Lula's third term, he was spending so much time focused on places like Ukraine and Gaza, and perhaps China and the United States, that he was seen as not sufficiently focused on places like Buenos Aires, Santiago, Bogota, and Mexico City, which has always been kind of the other, uh, you know, almost equally sized rival to Brazil in so many international forums. So, the other part of this, Will, is that uh, Brazilians and I think some Brazilian diplomats as well tend to believe that Brazil's power over the years has been a function of its size. And I disagree. I think that when Brazil is influential, it's because Brazil is successful. And, that's why there was so much genuine power in the region. Brazil was seen as such an example during the 2000s, during the commodities boom. Every
Hmm.
country in South America was going through a commodities boom during those years, but Brazil was really seen as the one that did the best job of growing its influence on the international stage, of distributing that windfall equally in a way that brought, millions of people into the middle class. And that was the period of at least my career when I heard the most admiration for Brazil. Today, I think there's a recognition that Uh, and this is not a partisan statement. I think that, Brazil has recovered compared to where it was 10 years ago. But there are these big questions about polarization. Everyone around the region remembers what happened on January 8th, 2023. Um, but to be fair, nobody's house is impeccable at this time. I mean, maybe Uruguay, right? Maybe Chile, which has this marvelous tradition where one final thing here, I mean, Chile has this marvelous tradition where they not only count the votes as fast as the Brazilians do, but then the two candidates have a phone call in full public view, hours like on the same election night, where the loser of the runoff congratulates the winner and they
Mhm.
exchange niceties. And, I can't imagine that happening in the United States today. And I can't imagine it happening in Brazil or a lot of other countries either.
You mentioned rare earths, rare minerals a couple of times. That's something that 3 years ago, I don't think any Brazilian investor ever mentioned those words and Brazil together, right? It was something that China had. Everybody knew that we needed it, but it was what it was. Again, during Brazil Week, that's all everybody wanted to talk about is how Brazil is going to dominate that, and we need the legislation around it. Um, you also mentioned that Brazil now is a major producer of oil. Um, could we have another super commodity type cycle that would help get Brazil out of this fiscal mess without having to do the hard lifting?
My worry, Will, is that we're already in that super cycle and that it just hasn't been as uplifting as the previous one. I mean, I travel within Brazil and you go to places like Mato Grosso and you see, or Goiás, and you see the effect of this incredibly dynamic agribusiness sector. Um, I'm from Texas, Will, and those places look like home.
Hmm.
You go to Goiás and you see new pickup trucks and shiny new malls, and every place has got great air conditioning. It's freezing cold inside, it feels like home. Um, and yet elsewhere in the country, you don't really feel that because, agribusiness is great for the bottom line and it looks good in GDP numbers and export numbers. Some of that trickles down, but most of the people are, not employed in the agribusiness sector. They're part of this services sector where, productivity has been stagnant or falling for many years now. It's not all apocalyptic. I mean, we mentioned innovations like PICS and the tax, labor, and pension reforms that have added some dynamism to the economy in recent years. But you do worry that maybe we're at a moment where Brazil, instead of growing 2%, should be growing at 3.5 or 4. Um, I'm curious to hear you on this. I mean, do you agree?
I do, but I also have a hard time explaining to somebody that doesn't know Brazil very well, and sometimes even thinking about it myself, how is the country even delivering 2% growth overall with real rates in the 9 or 10% rate on the third year or fourth year already with that, right? It's one of these things that Brazil is different in a certain way, but it can't be different forever. At some point, you have to kind of fix that. So is that moment coming now, or that's something that will be it's left for the next administration for sure, and it's not an easy fix. But it's going to take not just the Congress, with the blessing of the judicial to be able to break some of these tie-ups that you have on the budget side. Um, and then you can bring rates down enough where growth can be more widespread and not just localized in the agribusiness and commodities. Um, and I think a lot of the discussion that we were having here a couple weeks ago was that are we just going to be exporting rare minerals, or are we going to be producing things and then be exporting value-added goods out of Brazil? And that's always been the case, right? Where we're mostly exporting commodities or low-level products rather than high, higher value-added products.
Yeah, despite having made an argument earlier about the relative unimportance of the Brazilian election, um, I do think that that is probably the biggest, uh, point that will be decided by this election is how enthusiastically the next government takes on this fiscal question, which is undoubtedly slowing down the economy. And as you just pointed out, ironically, preventing many consumers from fully enjoying the fruits of this moment because rates are so high. And I personally, as someone who has followed Lula very closely for more than 20 years, I think it's valid to ask whether he would pursue, does he really want his, what by all accounts would be his final term in office, his fourth term? Does he really want to spend his final term making these difficult cuts? Is that what he wants his legacy to be? And I think, not every leader thinks about legacy. Most do. Lula does.
Right.
And, that's what motivates I'm told by people close to him, that's what motivates a guy who's 80, almost 81 years old to be on the road and in the air and out in front of crowds and still doing like this extremely difficult job at a time when most sane human beings have, retired and gone to the beach and
Right.
enjoyed, their family. And, he really sees himself on a level of not only Brazilian figures like Getulio Vargas, but global figures like Nelson Mandela, to whom Lula has compared himself.
Hmm.
So, does that sound like a guy who's going to walk in for his fourth term in January of 2027 and say, we're all going to have to tighten our belts for a while? Maybe. And he'll have to do some version of that. But I think it's fair to question whether he would do it with the necessary vigor and leadership, because he's not just going to have to convince people in his own party or in his own cabinet, as we've been discussing, Will. He's going to have to convince people in Congress as well.
Right. Brian, you've been so generous for your time. One last question for you. I mean, you mentioned Lula's been around for 37 years, likely his last election. We have all these new young politicians that we can talk about at a later podcast. We have new business people in Brazil coming up as well. Um, what gives you hope for Brazil? You've been following Brazil for your whole career. What, what gives you hope for Brazil for the next quarter century?
Over the last 25 years, Will, I have developed an allergy to the word potential because I think it is such a crutch in, I think, all of our countries, but you hear it a lot in Brazil.
Like
It's
the
sort of,
guru.
yeah, and the word that I prefer to think of is opportunity. It's different to me. You're not talking about something theoretical. You're talking about something that's actually there in front of you. And, I really do strongly believe that if Brazil can make some progress on getting its fiscal house in order, I think that these next 20 years offer tremendous opportunity for a country that is both geographically and geopolitically distant from the world's conflict zones. Put another way, Will, I'm pessimistic about the world as a whole, which makes me a little more optimistic about Brazil.
Hmm.
I worry that we're going into a new era of, multipolarity and sort of great power conflict that rarely goes well, by the way. I mean, there are people who are excited about multipolarity, and I wonder sometimes if they've read any history. I mean, it was multipolarity that led us into World War I, for example. But that appears to be where we're going. And so I think the studied neutrality of Brazil as a country that, kind of tries to be friends with everybody, and has seen a 50% increase in its agricultural production this century. That's an astonishing figure and proof again that these should have been really great years instead of just sort of fair to good years when you have that kind of growth. I think that there is an opportunity, or like a real opportunity, for Brazil to leverage that even better in these next 10 to 20 years. Um, as perhaps conditions in other countries become more difficult.
Brian, thank you so much for your time with us today. Enjoy the World Cup. And I'm not going to put you in the spot and ask you who you think is going to win, but let's hope that it's somebody from Latin America.
Let's hope. Thank you, Will, for the invitation.